Hello. Today I'm continuing with The Call of the Wild by Jack London. We're going to be continuing with Chapter 1, the second half of Chapter 1. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt. And he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth, till he realized that's what they wanted. Whereupon he laid down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted onto a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was crated about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and parcels upon a ferry steamer. He was tucked off the steamer into a great railway depot. And finally, he was deposited in an express car. For 2 days and nights, this express car was dragged along at the tail of shrieking locomotives, and for 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger, he had met the first advances of the express managers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly, he knew. But therefore, the more outrage to his dignity, and his anger waxed and waxed. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering and found his wrath of fever pitch. For that matter, high strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever, which was fled by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck. That had given them an unfair advantage, but now that it was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that, he was resolved. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during these 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first fell foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosized into a raging fiend. So changed was he that Judge himself would not have recognized him, and that the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man, Buck Devine, the next tormentor. And he hurled himself savagely against the bars, and the man smiled grimly and brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't gonna take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the 4 men who had carried it in. From the safe perches on top of the wall, they prepared to watch the performance. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater calmly intent on getting him out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," he said, when he had made an opening sufficient for the passage of Buck's body. At the same time, he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil as he drew himself together for the spring, hair bristling, mouth frothing. a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man, he launched his 140 pounds of fury, surcharged with pent passion of 2 days and nights. In midair, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together with an agonizing clip. He whirled over, fetching the ground on his back and side. He had never been struck by a club in his life, and he did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet and launched into the air, and again the shock came as he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time, he was aware that it was the club. But his madness knew no caution. A dozen times he charged, and as often the club broke the charge and smashed him down. After a particularly fierce blow, he crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush. He staggered limply about, the blood flowing from his nose and his mouth and his ears. His beautiful coat sprayed and flecked with bloody slather. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful bow on the nose. All the pain he had endured was nothing compared with the exquisite agony of this. With a roar that was almost lion-like, as its ferocity, it came again, hurled himself at the man. But the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him by the underjaw, at the same time wrenching downward and backward. Buck described a complete circle in the air and a half of another, and then crashed to the ground on his head and chest. For the last time he rushed. The man struck and shooed, blow he had purposely withheld for so long, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked utterly senseless. "He's no slouch at dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. "Doth a break causes any day, and twice on Sundays," was the reply of the driver, as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name of Buck," the man said, quoting from the saloon-keeper's letter which he had announced the consignment of the crate and contents. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a general voice, "we've had our little ruction, and the best thing you can do is to let it go at it. You just learn your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and I'll go well, and the goose hang high. Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffing out of you. Understand?" And as he spoke, he fearlessly patted the head he had so mercilessly pounded. And though Buck's hair involuntarily bristled at the touch of the hand, he endured it without protest. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly, and later bolted the generous meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that. But he was not broken. He saw for once, for all, that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He had learned that lesson, and in all his later life, he never forgot it. That club was a revelation. It was his introduction into the reign of primitive law. And he met the introduction halfway. The facts of life took on a fiercer aspect, and while he faced that aspect uncowed, he faced it with all the latent cunning of his nature aroused. As the day went by, other dogs came, in crates and at the ends of ropes, some docilely and some raging and roaring as he had come. And one and all, he watched them pass under the domination of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at the brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with a club is a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily consolidated. Of this last Buck was never guilty. Though he did see the beaten dogs that fawned upon the man and wagged their tails and licked his hand, he also saw one dog that would neither consolidate or obey, finally killed in the struggle for mastery. Now and again, man came. Strangers who talked excitedly, willingly, and in all kinds of fashions to the man in the red sweater. And at such times that money passed between them, strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back, but the fear of the future was strong upon them, and he was glad each time when he was not selected. Yet this time came, in the end, in the form of a little weazened man who spat broken English and many strange, uncouth exclamations which Buck could not understand. "Sacredem," he cried, when his eyes lit up upon Buck. "Dat one fine bully dog, eh? How much?" 300, and a present at that, was the prompt reply of the man in the red sweater. "And seeing it's government money, you ain't got no kicking coming, Burrows." Burrows grinned. Considering that price of dogs had been boomed skyward by the unwanted demand, it was not an unfair sum for so fine an animal. The Canadian government would be no loser, nor would its dispatches travel the slower. Burrows knew that dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew that he was 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he commented mentally. Buck saw money pass between them, and was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland, and he were led away by the little weazened man. That was the last he saw of the man in the red sweater. And as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of Norwell, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Burrows and turned over to a black-faced giant called Francois. Burrows was a French-Canadian and swarthy, but Francois was a French-Canadian half-breed and twice as swarthy. They were a new kind of men to Buck, of which he was destined to see many more. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Burrows and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. In the 'tween decks of Norwell, Buck and Curly joined 2 other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white fellow from Spitzbergen who had been brought away by a whaling captain and who had later been accompanied by a geological survey to the Barrens. He was friendly in a treacherous sort of way, smiling onto one's face while he meditated some underhand trick. As for instance, when he stole from Buck's food at the first meal. As Buck sprang to punish him, the lash of Francois's whip sang through the air, punishing the culprit first, and nothing remained but Buck to recover the bone. That was fair at Francois, he decided, and the half-breed began to rise in Buck's estimation. The other dog made no advances, nor received any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, morose fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he desired was to be left alone, and further, that there would be no trouble if he were left alone. Dave, he was called. And he ate and slept or yawned between times, and took interest in nothing, not even when the Norwell crossed the Queen Charlotte stand and rolled and pitched, and Buck like a thing possessed. When Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, he raised his head as though annoyed and favored them with a curious glance, yawned, and went to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed of the tireless pulse of the propeller, and though one day was very like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder. At last, one morning, the propeller was quiet, and the narwhal was pervaded with an atmosphere of excitement. He felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that a change was at hand. Francois leashed them and brought them on the deck. At the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into the white, mushy something, very like mud. He sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more of it fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some upon his tongue. It bit like fire, and then the next instant was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again, and the same result. The onlookers laughed, and he felt ashamed. He knew not why, for this was his first snow. That concludes the first chapter of The Call of the Wild. The next question that I have for you is, what are the reasons Buck and the man in the red sweater use violence? Thanks. Bye.